The top headlines of the hour. Trump considers a range of options against Iran, including possible military action as protests challenge the clerical leadership. Iran says it is ready for both war and dialogue, with the rights groups reporting the death toll has been risen to 500 people. Iran's parliament speaker calls the crackdown on protests a war against terrorists as he addresses a large pro-government rally in Tehran. Mohammed Bagher Ghalibaf says Iran is fighting a four-front war, including against the US and Israel, and warns of retaliation if attacked. The EU Defence Commissioner says NATO would collapse if the US took Greenland by force, and EU states must defend Denmark against military aggression. Trump says the US must control Greenland to block Russian or Chinese influence in the strategic Arctic region. The International Court of Justice begins hearing a rare full genocide case, with Gambia accusing Myanmar of targeting Rohingya Muslims for destruction. Myanmar denies the charges, saying its actions were counter-terrorism as Rohingya victims seek justice. Venezuela says it has released 116 prisoners, adding to earlier December releases, with the Justice Ministry saying they were detained for disrupting the constitutional order. The move follows the US capture of Nicolas Maduro and comes as political pressures and demands for reconciliation mount. Sudan's army says it is preparing a major operation to retake Kordofan and Darfur from the Rapid Support Forces as the civil war enters its third year. The military says RSF capabilities are being assessed and multiple formations are ready for a large-scale attack. Israel's Jerome Powell says the administration threatens legal action against him to gain influence over Federal Reserve interest rate policy. A top Republican senator warns the move undermines Justice Department credibility and vows to block future Fed appointments. We start with our ongoing coverage of the situation in Iran, and the European Union is considering new sanctions on the country following the violent crackdown on protesters. EU officials say they are ready to propose tougher measures targeting Tehran's leadership and key economic sectors. Listen in to what the chief spokesperson of the EU Commission had to say.
Has been also already clear positioning on this on our side, and also from the President, from President von der Leyen, we are looking into indeed further sanctions.
Western sanctions on Iran are already extensive. The US has imposed a near-total economic embargo, blocking oil exports, financial transactions and access to international trade. The EU restricts trade in oil, petrochemicals and dual-use technology, while the UN has also targeted Tehran in the past. These sanctions have crippled Iran's economy, causing severe inflation, currency collapse, rising unemployment and growing poverty. Iran is already facing nationwide protests due to the economic downfall, with experts believing that the new sanctions could create a vicious cycle. Joining us now to discuss this is Mohammed Osman. He is a Middle East expert. He joins us live from Cairo. Mohammed, thank you very much for taking the time and joining us. Of course, as these protests are ongoing, diplomatic efforts continue. How might these new wave of sanctions that have just been pitched by the European Union impact the already economic fragility of the Iranian state?
Thank you for having me, Thomas. Always a pleasure to be with you again. Of course, these sanctions will not really have that much of an effect on Iran, as Iran is already suffering under very crippling sanctions, especially after the reactivation of the snapback mechanism back in the fall of 2025, with those same very European countries, the E3 countries, Germany, Britain, and France, decided to reactivate the mechanism under the 2015 nuclear agreement, which led to basically the reinstatement of all the UN sanctions on the Iranian government. So basically, and this was one of the root causes of the current unrest in Iran. These demonstrations, this massive uprising against the government, against the regime, is driven by the deterioration of the living conditions and the economic situation in the country. So adding more sanctions really will aggravate the situation further and will not really help resolve it in any one way or the other, because right now it doesn't seem that even though the uprising is strong, it is bigger than previous times, and the Iranian government seems to be on their back foot. However, it doesn't seem that the regime is teetering on the verge of collapse. It doesn't seem that it has reached this point yet. The regime, yes, has been weakened by sustained sanctions over the decades and the reinstatement of even more sanctions as of late. And the latest Israeli war of aggression against Iran also played a role in destabilizing the government and weakening the regime. Yet it's not really weak enough in order it just to fall as a result of popular demonstrations, at least given the current variables. So basically, the European Union is just joining the American bandwagon when it comes to Iran. Maximize pressure, hoping that it will weaken the regime so that it would eventually fall. I think that the West is moving past the idea of reaching some sort of arrangement with Iran with regards to the sticking issues like the nuclear program, like the missile program, like the Iranian role in the region in support of certain non-state actors. It seems that they have now elected to move towards maximum pressure on Iran, basically hoping this would collapse the regime.
And Mohammed, of course, these protests that are ongoing in the top of every news bulletin were initially started because of the economic disparity that occurs in the country. How does it affect the day-to-day life of the 92 million people living in Iran?
Well, as far as we have heard, ordinary life has been restored in some cities, while some other cities still there is some cautious silence. Most of the riots and the protests now tend to take place at night, but of course we have an information blackout in Iran, Thomas, and of course you know that very well. The Iranians have imposed an internet blackout over the past few days. We basically do not really know the magnanimity and the scale of what's going on inside Iran. What we have heard through what has been leaked through some internet images and videos that were filmed and shared via the Starlink technology, which Iran is largely blocking as well now, according to Western media sources. It seems that they have massacred hundreds of protesters, at least 500, according to Reuters, I've heard. So, of course, this means that they are carrying out a very heavy-handed crackdown. So it seems that ordinary life at daytime, at least when we look at Iranian state TV and we listen to independent media correspondents inside Iran, they say that in daytime things are normal. At night, the riots, of course, consume certain parts of the capital, Tehran, and other cities. So I don't think they have stabilized the situation yet. However, it seems that the crackdown is still ongoing relentlessly.
So the foundations of these protests are obviously caused by economic hardships. As we said, the United States pretty much has an embargo on all Iranian exports. The European Union now speaking about adding further sanctions on Tehran, with of course those E3 ones that snapped back into play. If these protests do de-escalate, how does what economic lifelines does Iran have left, if any?
It doesn't really have much, even though Russia and China have said that they do not recognize the reactivation of the sanctions regime against Iran, and many countries in the global south joined suit. However, it doesn't seem that there are really any channels by which most other countries can economically create partnerships with Iran without angering the United States. And when it comes to Russia and China, it seems that they are exploiting the current situation to their advantage. China is buying very cheap oil from Iran, and it seems that it's not really interested in injecting any cash flows, for example, into Iran in order to help the regime overcome the acute economic crisis it's in right now. Russia also doesn't seem that they are very interested in propping up Iran economically. They sell them weapons, but that's about it, it seems. So it doesn't really seem that even the Iranian government's core allies, Russia and China, are really willing to do much in order to save the Islamic Republic at this point, which is very concerning, it seems. And of course, further sanctions will only aggravate the situation. And as you just said, this time the uprising or the demonstrations are different. This time they are driven by economic hardships. So this means that worsening economic conditions, even if the crackdown succeeds in quelling this wave of demonstrations or uprising, that doesn't mean that in a few weeks, with the worsening of the economic conditions, the situation will escalate once again into massive protests and massive unrest. So the problem is that now the problem is becoming predominantly economic. It predominantly relates to the living standards and conditions of the average Iranian citizen, and this is what makes this challenge to the Iranian regime much more complex and hard than any other challenge over the past 45 years.
Indeed. Mohammed Osman, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. It's a pleasure to have you on the programme as always. Now, of course, as protests span worldwide in regards to the Iran situation, in Los Angeles, a U-Haul truck drove into protesters during a demonstration in Westwood against the Iranian government. Police quickly took the driver into custody following the incident. Hundreds of people had gathered outside a federal building on Wilshire Boulevard as part of ongoing protests linked to unrest in Iran. Authorities say one adult was struck by the vehicle but did not sustain serious injuries. Two others were evaluated at the scene but declined treatment. Police confirmed that the driver was injured during the chaos following the incident. The Los Angeles Fire Department and local law enforcement are investigating the circumstances that led to the truck entering the protest. No ambulances were called to the scene, and there are no reports of critical injuries at this time. Okay, next we turn to Europe, and Russia's defense ministry has said that its forces have taken control of Novoboyinsk in eastern Ukraine. The claim was reported by local reports. According to the ministry, Russian troops advanced in the area and established control over the settlement during ongoing military operations. There has been no immediate confirmation from Ukrainian authorities, however. Independent verification of battlefield claims remains difficult and during the continued fighting. The situation on the ground is still evolving, with intense clashes reported across several sectors of eastern Ukraine. Joining us now to discuss the ongoing conflict in Europe's east is Andrew Latham. He's an international affairs expert. He joins us live from Minneapolis. Andrew, of course, the fighting rages on. Diplomatic updates have slowed down. However, we've, of course, conflict continues on the front lines and aerial strikes continue to fly over cross borders. The current state of the conflict in Ukraine, what's your analysis of it, and are we any further towards peace?
Well, we are further towards peace in that this war eventually will end, and it looks like it's going to end in Russia's favor if current trend lines play out. On the battlefield, Russia continues to make slow, grinding, steady advances. This is a war of attrition, not territory, although territory matters. And when it comes to that, the Russians are paying a heavy price, but they have a greater pool of manpower resources than the Ukrainians. And I would suggest that there's a very real possibility that Ukraine will break before Russia does when it comes to tapping those manpower reserves. So, and then there's a third dimension, which is the strategic long-range strike dimension. The Russians are inflicting crippling damage on the energy infrastructure of Ukraine, which is necessary to power its arms plants, but also to keep its people warm and mobile. All of that is falling apart. So if you're looking for a blitzkrieg-like outcome, some daring dash in Kyiv, that's not going to happen. If you're looking for a World War I kind of attritional grinding down and therefore defeating the enemy, that's what we're likely to see. And I think that's what we're witnessing right now.
Yeah, of course, diplomatic efforts also continue, but with the Trump administration's focused on the ongoing Venezuela and Iran situation, we haven't had any significant updates in regards to that. However, the narrative seems to be bending that Donald Trump is sympathizing with the Ukrainian cause slightly more today. Of course, we've seen that meeting in Europe with European leaders and Zelensky, where security guarantees were penned. Donald Trump says he needs to sign off on them, though, of course. Looking at the way that the Trump administration, his envoys and the man himself have acted, how do you think that Donald Trump will react to the ongoing, of course, new developments when it comes to Putin's aggression?
Well, it's hard to say. Some days the president is quite pro-Russian. Other days he's quite pro-Ukrainian. It has to do with domestic politics in the U.S., but also what's going on the battlefield and what's going on around the diplomatic negotiating table. At the end of the day, Donald Trump matters, but I don't think he's dispositive. The reason why there's been no success at that diplomatic negotiating table is that the bottom line of both Ukrainians and the Russians are incompatible. And there's no real way to compromise around Ukrainian neutrality or ceding large chunks of territory to Russia or some of the other things that the Russians are demanding as their absolute red lines that they're not willing to negotiate. So it's commendable that the President of the United States weighs in sometimes and puts pressure on Putin or Zelensky. It's admirable that the Europeans are trying to negotiate some kind of security guarantee, which, by the way, is a Russian red line. And they signaled that over the weekend by firing a ballistic missile at one of the westernmost cities in Ukraine as a signal to the Europeans, you know, if you put troops in Ukraine, they're legitimate targets, and the Russians have said as much. So despite all the best efforts of all the best middle powers and all the best negotiators, the distance between Kyiv and Moscow remains enormous. And I rather suspect that it will only be as a result of victory on the battlefield or mutual and complete exhaustion, and we're not quite there yet, that will bring this to an end. Not the interventions of President Trump, and certainly not the interventions of Ms. von der Leyen.
Another update we've had today that is the European Union says it's not ready yet after an announcement saying that the possibility of speaking to Vladimir Putin and re-engagement with Russia. When will Europe be ready, like the United States did in Alaska, to talk to Vladimir Putin, or at least his administration directly?
Well, Alaska was one person representing one state dealing with another person representing that state. The European Union, of course, even the coalition of the willing, is divided internally in terms of ends and means, in terms of their dispositions within NATO, European NATO, for example. Some are more favorably inclined towards Russia. Hungary, for example. Germany itself has had a number of elections recently which have brought increased the power of parties, political parties, that are not in favor of supporting Ukraine, not in favor of arming it or providing security forces. So the Europeans have to sort out the matter internally before they can take it to the table with Putin. And I see no real progress there either, not even amongst the coalition of the willing, because Germany is an important part of that. And Germany, for domestic political reasons, is kind of immobilized at the moment on this front. So I'm not hopeful that progress will be made at any negotiating table. I think the progress is going to be made on the battlefield. It's going to be slow, grinding, and bloody. And I'm not advocating this or celebrating it by any means, but if I'm looking at this impartially from 30,000 feet up, it's the Russians who have the upper hand.
Indeed. Andrew, do stay with us once again as we stay in Europe, but move over to Greenland. And European officials warned that a US military takeover could threaten NATO. European Commissioner for Defence and Space, Andrius Kalaboulis, said that any attempt by the United States to seize Greenland by force would trigger Article 42.7 of the EU treaty, obliging member states to assist Denmark in the case of military aggression. Greenland, an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark, has repeatedly stated it is not for sale. US President Donald Trump has insisted the island must be under American control to prevent Russia or China from gaining strategic advantage without ruling out force. Commissioner Kalibus called such an action very, very negative and said NATO and Europe would face serious consequences, highlighting the high stakes of Arctic security and international diplomacy. Andrew joins us once again to discuss this further. Andrew, of course, the Trump administration is the leader of the most powerful military in the world. There's no doubt that the United States could take Greenland if it wanted to. However, what do you think is the most likely pathway for the United States to take, and what options are there?
Well, there are the status quo is an option, which is the United States already under treaty signed with Denmark in 1951 and renewed in 2004, has basing rights, has all kinds of access rights to Greenland. It doesn't need anything more in order to advance the security agenda of Washington in the Arctic or the North Atlantic. It simply doesn't. It could offer to buy the island from the Kingdom of Denmark. It's done that. It's been turned down. It could offer to pay the people of Greenland to vote in favor of joining the United States. The numbers between 10,000 and 100,000 US dollars have been floated internally. But I think there's another option which people aren't talking about, and that's the arrangement that the United States has with various Pacific Island nations, which is an economic union, complete internal sovereignty for those countries, but an economic union, and the United States is responsible for security and military matters. And by the way, the citizens of those countries have the right to live and work in the United States. That's an option that hasn't been floated here. I think it's a good second best, the best being the status quo. It's a good second best option for the U.S., for Greenlanders, but nobody's put it on the table, and I suspect that they're not going to.
And Andrew, ruling out military options here, if the United States does go behind Denmark's back, of course, a traditional ally, diplomatically and makes direct contact with the people from Greenland and acquires it a different way, how would that turn out? Would that be the same sort of violation as military intervention?
Well, it kind of depends on how it happens, the modalities. If the people of Greenland, and this has been a movement for the last few decades, continue to move towards independence. I mean, right now they're basically a colony of Denmark. If they continue to move towards independence, declare independence, and then 5 minutes later strike some deal with the United States, either incorporation as the 51st state, I doubt it, or this kind of arrangement that the U.S. has with Palau and the Marshall Islands and countries like that, then there's not much that the Kingdom of Denmark can do about that. And that would have to be the sequence, though. There would have to be a declaration of independence on the part of the Greenlanders. That would have to be recognized internationally, and then the Greenlandic people could decide for themselves. Do they want to continue to be independent? Do they want to enter into some kind of an arrangement with the U.S. or with Canada or whomever? It depends. That's entirely up to them. Either way, right now the noises coming out of the White House and the reciprocal noises coming out of various European capitals are really quite corrosive of the NATO alliance. They're really undermining it at a moment when Russian and Chinese pressure in Europe and in the Arctic and beyond require NATO to be in top form. And to the extent that this back and forth around Greenland is corrosive of the unity of purpose and action of NATO, it can't be in NATO's best interests, and therefore, ironically, cannot be in the best interest of the United States, or Greenland for that matter. That's where we are. It remains to be seen over the coming weeks and months where we end up.
Andrew Latham, thank you very much for taking the time and joining us. As always, it's a pleasure to speak to you. We now move on, and a landmark case accusing Myanmar of committing genocide against minority Muslim Rohingya has opened at the United Nations top court. It is the first genocide case the International Court of Justice will hear in full in more than a decade. The outcome will have repercussions beyond Myanmar, likely affecting South Africa's genocide case at the ICJ over Israel in regards to the war in Gaza. Speaking in The Hague before the hearings, Rohingya victims said that they want the long-awaited court case to deliver justice. Let's take a listen in to what they had to say.
একদম বড় বড় আশালা আসি যেননিকে আরা বর্মামাদে জুলুম নির্যাতন হাই আরা মা বোন হাড়ি ফেলাইয়ে মা বোন এদের রেপ করছে গদ্দর ফুরাত দি ফেলাইয়ে জিনিসপত্র লুটফাট করছে গুড়া গুড়া ফান হারিয়ে অনেক টালামালা দিয়ে এর জিনিস গরম জড়িয়ে আরা তুন দেশের তো বাইর করে দি ফেলাই আরা বাংলাদেশের রিফিউজি ক্যাম্প আসি আরা এদের
আশা করি দে আসি যে কুড়তুন আরা রেন স্টন দিয়া পড়বে জাস্টিক আরা জিয়ান নাকি সার আরা বর্মা ফিরি যাইবালা জিয়ান নাকি আরা আশা করি ইয়ান আরা তো আসি যে কুড়তো আরা ইয়ান সার বিচারিয়ান সার মানে ফুনানি মাঝে আরা রে বর্মা মা স্টম করিও রে মি অলঙ্গারে দর করি ইল্লে জুনুসা টান ন করে ফান আরা ইল্লা করে স্টম করে আসি যে কুড়তো আরা ইয়ান সার.
While Myanmar has denied accusations of genocide, the predominantly Muslim West African country of Gambia filed the case at the International Criminal Court. It also known as the World Court in 2019, accusing Myanmar of committing genocide against the Rohingya, a mainly Muslim majority in the remote western Rakhine state. Myanmar's armed forces launched an offensive in 2017 that forced at least 730,000 Rohingya from their homes into neighbouring Bangladesh, where they recounted killings, mass rape and arson. A UN fact-finding mission concluded the 2017 military offensive had included genocidal acts. Let's listen in to what the Legal Action Worldwide's Executive Director Antonia has had to say on the hearing.
In a world today where international justice institutions, international law is under attack, I think there can never be a more important moment to be at the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court. The Rohingya people have been asking for justice for decades. Finally, after more than 6 years, we come to the full proceedings of this case. We hope that the court will find Myanmar liable for genocide and will order Myanmar to make reparations for the Rohingya people, to acknowledge what has happened. They can even order domestic and international criminal proceedings to take place. So it's really a landmark moment for the Rohingya victims delegation who have travelled from Cox's Bazar, who will be in the court listening to the Myanmar, but also for the Rohingya community as a whole, and we believe for genocide survivors all around the world.
Pope Leo XIV met with Venezuelan opposition leader and Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado at the Vatican. The audience was listed in the Pope's official schedule but had not been announced in advance, and the Vatican provided no details about the meeting. Pope Leo, the first US Pope, has recently urged respect for Venezuela's sovereignty and criticized the use of military force in diplomacy after US forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Machado was barred from Venezuela's 2024 presidential election by authorities aligned with Maduro. She later received the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts promoting democracy and is expected to travel to the United States for further meetings this week. Well, that's all that we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates.